Okay, hi everyone. I'm Danny Caputi, and I'm going to be talking about weather influences. So, just as some background first, I am I'm sort of a meteorologist. I graduated from Stony Brook University on Long Island in New York in December 2013, and I'm now a first year PhD graduate student at UC Davis for atmospheric science, which is essentially meteorology. Um, so I've been interested in weather for a really long time, since I was very little, and only the last few years have I really been on board with all this consciousness stuff. So originally I was interested in the problem of the self when I got interested in consciousness, but um, this psi stuff I also found very interesting. And so I never really thought of a connection between my weather and consciousness interests until it occurred to me one day that um, maybe our conscious minds, if psi exists, which it's pretty clear to me that the evidence is pretty convincing that psi has some real effects, then maybe consciousness can influence the atmosphere. So the more I thought about this, the bigger idea this sort of became in my head. And so I'm going to go through this idea, which is essentially a research proposal, and then I'm going to bring in ideas from the course presentations to hopefully to connect these findings in the field of parapsychology and integrate what I learned in the course with this approach I'm taking. And then I'm going to leave some contact information because I am looking to start some experiments with this, and I'm hoping to get participants. So if you would be interested at all, I would just put your name on a mailing list. You'd be committed to absolutely nothing. Um, I will get into that more at the end. Okay, so since this is currently unpublished, I would just like to ask that this be respected as intellectual property. And what this basically means is just please don't redistribute any of like these slides without my permission. In other words, just like don't like copy them and put them somewhere else without like you know citing me and just running it by me first. Just because it's unpublished and this is sort of new territory, and I appreciate your cooperation with that. Okay, so how can we influence weather? Um, so hopefully, most of you are on board with the idea that humans demonstrably impact climate, that we're contributing to climate change. Um, Even if by chance you're not, I mean, it's pretty clear that our actions can impact the environment to some degree. I mean, it's debated exactly to what degree, but it's pretty clear that we can have an influence on the environment. So, my question though is a bit separate. It's basically, could there be a direct causal link between mental intentions or states of consciousness and atmospheric perturbations, which are basically, in other words, um, can you go outside and do a rain dance and have that actually generate a shower, so to speak? Um, I'm coining this term as mental weather influence, which is going to appear throughout this talk, or MWI. And this is just sort of another cool term I thought of it, Gaia PK as opposed to bio PK. Gaia, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that term. It's like basically a term for the Earth as like a living system. And as far as I know, this idea has yet to be studied scientifically. That's to the best of my knowledge, but I looked pretty closely. And yeah, that's a shame because there's seems to be a lot of interest in this area, and there's a lot of anecdotes about people influencing weather. But yeah, that I don't think this has been actually studied scientifically in depth. Okay, so why study mental weather influence? Um, So this idea of chaos theory, which is maybe some of you have heard of it, the idea that a butterfly like flapping its wings in one place could like generate a tornado, across the globe. Um, I mean, that's, well, who's to say if that's an exaggeration or not? We know so little about chaos and turbulence. Um, but basically, the idea is that um, as we saw in some of these talks throughout the course, the effect sizes that we're seeing in psychokinesis can be quite small. And, this is an issue for some people, even saying like that this is not good evidence of anything at all. But with the atmosphere, the thing is we have chaos on our side. Because in essence, like if you make a tiny ripple with your mind, that ripple could become a huge measurable effect. Okay, so and that leads into the second point. It can differentiate true psychokinetic effects from information gain forms of psi. I argue that because if you generate like an 80-mile-per-hour gust on like a calm day, like that's not going to just happen. And there's no way you can argue, oh, you just predicted that instead of like actually influenced the atmosphere. Um, so we would also, obviously, this would tell us more about nature. So we would learn more about our place, the physical place of consciousness in the universe. Um, Hopefully, and depending on what we learn, it could possibly close some of our knowledge gaps in like actual atmospheric physics, such as turbulence, cloud microphysics, um, and we just learn more about the atmosphere that way. Who knows? And so implications are really, I'd like to say there's an infinite amount of implications. So do we have a connection with the atmosphere? That's the question we're trying to answer scientifically. And if so, imagine those implications. There's a whole bunch of things that could stem from that related to climate change and how we're treating the earth. Maybe we could think of the earth as a biological system to heal. Um, and you can even, in principle, extend that to like a whole bunch of other human issues. Just, let your imagination run crazy there with possible implications from like demonstrating scientifically some kind of relationship we have with Mother Nature. And, learning more about psi and consciousness, of course. Okay, so these are exclusively my observations. I'm sort of categorizing these things here based off of my literature research. But what I've observed, there are two general forms that mental weather influence could take, which I'm going to call long and short. So, a long mental weather influence, for example, you could go out and like try to make rain, but you're not going to see anything for a few days. It's just like a sort of like a goal to like help a drought or a wildfire somewhere. And I've seen like cases of this like all the time. So you're not going to like see an instant perturbation on radar or any instantaneous response. You're going to see like rain come within a few days with a predictable atmospheric system, and the system will be like forecasted and everything. Um, Whether or not it be forecasted before or after the intention, I mean that's obviously the big question. But um, either way, it's the short mental weather influence, and I'm not at all trying to discredit the long ones. But it's the short ones, those are the ones that are going to be easier to study scientifically because they would, by nature, but just by the way I'm defining it, they'd have a sort of instantaneous response in the atmosphere. So, like, you do the same intention to try to make rain, but then immediately a cumulonimbus cloud develops and you get rain within a half hour. That's something we can see on radar. We can launch balloons into that. We can do a whole bunch of cool things to see what's going on there. Um, so yeah, this short mental weather influence, from what I've observed in the literature, again, I could be wrong on this, but this is from my research. It appears to be less common, and I sort of hypothesize that maybe it does require a higher level of spiritual wisdom because, that's, again, maybe an instantaneous response that requires a deeper connection with nature. Um, and yeah, so these are, again, basically just my observations. Okay, so speaking of literature, I mean, I could spend a while talking about specific cases reported of alleged mental weather influence, but instead I just want to claim that there are such cases out there, plenty of such cases, and I'm just going to point to some relevant literature here. So here are 3 books I recommend as starters for those of you interested in delving into this. Weather Shamanism by Nan Moss and David Corbin. The PK Man, True Story of Mind Over Matter by Jeffrey Mishlove. He talks about an amazing person that lived named Ted Owens. Maybe some of you have heard of him. And Sandra Ingerman's Medicine for the Earth. So these are some starting points, and within those books, they point to many other things you can look at, and many other literature. That's sort of where I started with this. Okay. So, who do we want to participate in mental weather influence research? Well, I mean everyone. We want to, but we also want to, in a sense, differentiate. Like who we're getting. So, um, I'm sure it's not really too controversial to say that, people that are experienced in meditation tend to do better on psi tasks. So, where we would want to, note from who's participating what their level sort of is. And of course, there are people out there, most notably some types of shamans that at least claim to be very able to create these massive observable weather effects. So with those kind of people, we can do sort of more individualized experiments, which is kind of along the lines of what I'm thinking. But again, we don't want to be dogmatic about saying like, oh, these people are definitely going to have higher effect sizes, because who knows? That's what we're doing research for, is to find out this kind of stuff. Okay. Just a quick note on ethics, although this is very important. We're attempting to influence, not control weather. Okay, if you read all that literature, they will all say the same exact thing, that we need to think of the atmosphere as a living and breathing system, something to connect with, and something we want to invite changes to occur, rather than thinking of it as like a lifeless system that we're trying to like physically control with our minds. Um, so that's a big one. And this is going to be important for both our own, I guess, sort of spiritual growth looking into this, and also gaining participants who have this worldview. Um, and I mean, I'm sort of saying I also personally I share that worldview. Like I read it and it made total sense to me. But like even if it doesn't make total sense to the researcher, it should be respected um, for working with participants. Um, and we can just reassure any weather workers that they can retain anonymity, because a lot of them may not want to perform tasks for fear of being solicited by people to like control weather. Two-eyed seeing, that's sort of what I just mentioned about respecting other worldviews, and mutual collaboration. So basically, we should be open to ideas from these higher level shamans and anyone we're working with. Like, for example, if they say, hey, why don't you participate in this experiment instead of just watching? Be open to that kind of thing. Um, and any intention we're setting up for designing an experiment, it should be to benefit all of nature, not just a specific ego. Now, arguably, yeah, we're gonna have to like, measure like little fluctuations in temperature, and it's going to be hard to see, okay, how is this going to benefit the whole globe? But we can lay out the purpose that, okay, we're trying to get these tiny little fluctuations to be observable in our data because we want to show the existence of this relationship we have with nature, to serve a much larger purpose. Okay. All right, so that all being said, let's get into the fun part, which is like actually some kind of experiments that I've come up with. Okay, first just a quick little 101 on cloud physics. Okay, so these are cumulus type clouds. Um, the puffy ones you see. Basically, they come out of rapidly rising air. Now, in this case, it's not too rapid, and you see these on a fair weather day. But keep in mind, this is also a cumulus type cloud. This is, it's a thicker one, but once it gets to this stage, we could be talking about some possible rain underneath it. And of course, this could grow even further, and you can get a cumulonimbus cloud or a thunderstorm. This is actually a supercell, so like the most severe type of cumulus cloud you can get. You can get tornadoes under these, hail, high winds, everything like that. But basically, you can have precipitation in like large scale systems, but again, we're focusing for this talk anyway on the short mental weather influence. So that's going to come out of these cumulus type showers. They develop very quickly and dissipate very quickly on short time scales. These things do not linger in the atmosphere for days, and they can't be forecasted any more than like individual cumulonimbus or thick cumulus type clouds can't be forecasted more than like an hour or so in advance, and even that's pretty hard to pinpoint exactly where they're going to be. Okay, so this is so again, we want to devise an experiment for like doing like a rain dance or doing some kind of mental weather intention to get it to rain on a short time scale. So in advance, we would specify some sampling interval, which we're going to look for rain at a specific point. Okay, so that's T sub S, which I have here. And also a time interval in which we'll accept the experiment as a success. That'll be tau here, which I labeled. So TS is separate from tau. We're sampling and then we're taking some interval. You could also have TS after, extending after tau. This is just one example of how you can set it up. It doesn't matter how you set it up as long as you do it beforehand. And T sub W, that's the time within T sub S that we recorded rain at this location, which we picked beforehand. And of course, it's only a success if you get rain within tau. So that's not counted. Okay, so we went in time, let's go in space now. So we have a specific point at which we're doing this experiment. And we'll pre-select a radius at which, we're seeing mostly dry air. Again, we pre-select this. We don't do this as the experiment's happening. And within the time interval tau, we'll also look at what areas within this radius experience precipitation or met our thresholds, and we'll call that A sub W. So this is the formula for the probability against chance I came up with, and you just plug in the numbers and basically get an answer for an experiment. So again, obviously this presumes that it was a success. If this wasn't a success, then you don't do this, obviously, but it's basically a ratio of the two areas times a ratio of the two times. So basically you would You would want to pick a location in advance, and to avoid the possibility that you just predicted rain there, um, you would maybe make it some kind of regular, some kind of systematic location, like a specific landmark or a specific even latitude and longitude if it's like in a desert and you have like a whole bunch of choices. Um, and maybe replicate it at that specific location on at very specific hours of the day. Obviously, you wouldn't do this every day, but you would replicate it like at like let's say 3 o'clock noon. That's like our pre-selected tau, or okay, tau is an interval, so that might be like 3 to 4 or something. Um, so something like that, just to give this the most scrutiny. Um, Now, this does not tell us. This is just looking at the probability based on where it rained and when it rained. But this doesn't even tell us physically what's going on. So, ideally, we would want to look for things like stability and moisture content in the atmosphere. If those two things are lacking and you just get a pop shower out of nowhere, that's really amazing. And to get a better clue of like how we physically interact with nature consciously, if like one experiment is a success, you can spend more money maybe and get weather balloon launches to get like good pictures like before and after the experiment and like everything like that. um, so yeah. Okay, another idea is lightning. So it's absurd to think that you could literally make lightning strike like anywhere you want, whenever you want, but it has been described in some of that literature I mentioned. For example, Ted Owens has had a couple of successful experiments where allegedly he did this. If you want to do this thoroughly with someone that maybe claims they can make lightning strike anywhere, you'd want to pick a specific location, like a specific target or area. You can add a parameter of timing, such as like even minute marks, like 12:28 and 0 seconds, 12:30 and 0 seconds, 12:32 and 0 seconds, things like that, to guard against the chance that you're just predicting when lightning's going to strike rather than um, actually influence it. And you can also do things like pick a storm cell that looks like it has some potential for lightning, but not too frequent lightning, so that you're not like, well, yeah, lightning hit where we wanted it to, but it also hit everywhere. So these are all parameters you can sort of manipulate and put different levels of constraints on it. If you really constrained all three and got someone that could like consistently every exactly 2 minutes lightning striking one particular area in a storm that was like relatively weak, I mean, that would be amazing. But you can see the range there in possible ways of interpreting an experiment results based on how tightly you make these constraints and like what tolerance you're giving. So you could, for example, give like a couple seconds of tolerance for the time interval, or a few 100 meters squared for the location, things like that. Okay, so with wind, this is my personal favorite. So there are multiple things you can do here. So there's I mean, the main thing, obviously, wind has a velocity. It has a direction and magnitude. So you can enhance its speed, you can suppress its speed, you can try to change its direction. Um, you can also try to change like the degree of turbulence, or in other words, like the standard deviation, some other statistic, or if you plotted like a frequency distribution, try to skew it left or skew it right. Frequency distribution of like velocities or directions, that is. Um, so, and physically, what the question is like, how are we interacting with turbulent eddies, with wind, with air currents? We could do this experiment in multiple different conditions because we want to see how it works in each. So, um, it may depend, like the level of the effect size you get, that may depend on the actual background velocity of the wind. So, for example, if it's high wind, you might get different effects than in like low wind conditions. How turbulent it is. So, is it very gusty or is it a steady kind of wind? And as I said before, like the degree of spiritual wisdom, so to speak, of the individual. I mean, I know that's a loaded term, but I think you get what I mean, like how much meditation experience they've had, etc. Okay, one particular area in wind that I think has a lot of potential to see large kind of effects is low level jets. So basically, what these are is they're basically extreme winds, but occurring aloft, not at the ground. So you don't like see extreme damage or anything. It gets windy on the ground, but not too um, not nearly as high as like 1,000 meters off the ground. And basically, these occur ahead of like frontal systems, and they transport warm and moist air from the south, which is what contributes to the stability of the air, which is why the stronger winds basically stay aloft. Um, I mean, thank goodness. Otherwise, we'd be getting like hurricane force winds on the East Coast like several times per year if we didn't have that kind of protection. Um, okay, so here's a profile of what of just one example of a low level jet. So you can see basically, and these are sustained winds, by the way. So this is basically if you averaged wind over a few minutes, what speeds you would get. These aren't gusts. The gusts are higher than this, but so basically at ground level, it's something like just under 30 miles per hour sustained. Um, and if you go up 1,000 feet, you're at close to 80 miles per hour, like around hurricane force. So this is basically what I was saying before. This was just plotted from a model. So the question is, you have very strong winds just off the ground. It it would not take large perturbation to possibly bring that wind down in like a instantaneous strong gust. Obviously, it wouldn't stay that way, but just getting a gust that's like much higher than the mean wind. Um, we did see higher gusts in this system, but they were something like 50 miles per hour, not 70 or 80. And you generally won't see 70 or 80 with this. So that's why this would like really suggest a psychokinetic type of thing. Um, now, obviously, you'd want to do this in an area that's not going to be exposed to damage, but basically, yeah, you can get a large effect this way. If you want to go the other way, you can think maybe go in a hurricane. That you already have extreme wind speeds, and now try to like really suppress the winds. Down to like 20 miles per hour in the eye wall where you're getting 90 mile per hour plus sustained winds or something like that. Um, I don't know. Okay, so another wind idea. Basically, and this is something I actually just talked to an expert recently about, is that I was sort of thinking that if you have higher levels of turbulence, um, you'd have more chaos and therefore more of an ability to detect smaller perturbations. But actually, what he said surprised me, which is that it's actually in stable air under the right conditions that you can trigger turbulence where you might see something more interesting. So we have 3D sonic anemometers, which are very sensitive to airflow in all directions, basically. Um, so similarly to some experiments which have been done to um, I saw the example in one of the PowerPoint presentations. I think it was the one with some work being done in Italy where they had a dinner plate or something rotating, um, or they tried to get people to mentally like rotate a suspended plate. Um, so maybe that was air currents. So maybe this would more directly measure something like that. Um, and so you could do like a true test for that kind of thing. And atriums, these two pictures here, this is on the left, that's the Luxor in Las Vegas, and on the right, that's the Marriott Marquis in New York City. Um, I think these are like really cool places. Like, unfortunately, there aren't many atriums in the world that are like 30 or 40 floors, but there are some, luckily, and these are basically natural like giant tanks of air, where you're sheltered from weather. There's still some air currents, but um, you're pretty much guaranteed to have background calm conditions. So you may be able to take advantage of that, and we're in a place where you're guaranteed to have background calm conditions, but have a lot of air to work with where effects could sort of happen. I think, at least anyway, that they'd be more likely to happen where you have more air to work with than in like a smaller room. Um, that's just a hunch, but you know. And there's also a lot of people that come through these settings, so maybe you could have like a giant screen showing like, oh, let's influence. I don't know. Okay, so everything I've talked about up until now in the experiment section, those were based on sort of individuals, for the most part, that could or that claim to have a high degree of ability in this. Um, so now I'm going to get into more of like a format that can be used for like a whole population, like a large group of people, but not necessarily experienced meditators or anything, trying to influence some atmospheric variable. So the general format is that we would have control and experimental epochs, which will alternate. Um, we'd make all the epochs equal length, um, probably like 5 minutes. An experimental session would have to be an odd multiple, the way I'm setting this up, of the epoch length. So basically, if you start the experiment, you'd end it like, as far as the subject is concerned, 25 minutes later. And it would start and end with an intention epoch. Okay, so this is just an animation of what I showed. Red is intention, and blue is control, where you would basically relax and not try to influence that atmospheric variable. Um, and then here's the key piece. So we want an equal number of intention and control epochs. So we would randomly place a control epoch either before or after, right? And that would be randomly selected. So, okay, in this case it went to before, but it could have just as likely went to the other one. Okay, so why is it that we randomize this? Well, that's basically just because, let's say we were unconsciously, systematically doing something where, let's say we started the experiment and let's say the atmospheric variable was like wind or something, and we always started the experiment as like a windstorm was coming in. If we did something like that and we systematically had the control epoch first, then we would see a false effect. Hopefully this graph pretty easily illustrates why. So that's why we need the random counterbalancing of that control epoch. Okay, and just to name some atmospheric variables we could do this with. And by the way, this is what I'm thinking of doing live experiments with, and it would be basically the instructions like intend versus relax. This would be broadcasted over like some kind of live webcast. So you could do these in the comfort of your home. And we'd hopefully do this with like hundreds of people. But anyway, so we could do it with humidity, like more specifically like specific or absolute humidity. We don't want to use relative humidity because that's actually temperature dependent. So yeah, just like a little misconception there. I just wanted to clear out. something like snowflake beauty. So this would sort of spin off of Radin's work with Emoto, where they influenced crystals. We could do something similar with snowflakes. We have something called a multi-angle snowflake camera now, which can basically take high-resolution pictures of snowflakes as they fall. It's really cool, actually. Um, and we could do this with wind. We just pick any location where there's an anemometer where we're going to get frequent enough data. And maybe we want to suppress it because, if we ask people to enhance wind, even if it's light, my experience talking with people is that people don't want to invite, possible like damaging effects, anything that could be consequential unintentionally. Um, could do this with lightning rates. Maybe we don't want, or maybe we wouldn't ask a population per se to like, okay, try to make lightning strike the Empire State Building at this specific time, but we might say try to suppress the lightning rate in this storm, and we can later archive data and see if that's actually what occurred. Things like that. We're not limited to these variables. These are just ones I thought of. Okay, so I have this idea which I just presented to you. So now I'm going to take some time to explicitly mention how this ties into material that I've learned in this course. And in the following slides, the title of the talk I'm specifically referring to will be in the header. Okay, so with just the intro talk, we'll start there. So we're conducting true experiments. So this may seem strange given that the atmosphere is chaotic, but we're still able to do it. We can do this with the atmosphere even without necessarily saying like this is the control area, this is the experimental area, as I've explained, because we can randomize things like time periods. It's the same way you really do psychology research. No two people are the same. You can't have a control person and an experimental person, but you randomize the population well enough and have a large enough sample size and it works out. So it's the same kind of thing. So these are true experiments that we are aiming to do. That presentation talked about a whole bunch of different approaches, and this basically mixes them. So we're doing single case studies, we're doing experiments with single individuals, and experiments with the population. Finally, we're differentiating the hypothesis of, the environment is affected versus some person-acquired information, as I've explained in this talk, hopefully fairly thoroughly, why we're differentiating like true psychokinesis effects from the information gain forms of psi. And lastly, I just included a chart here on why this is scientific in my view, the process we're going through to approach this as a research subject. Okay, so this idea of global consciousness, Roger Nelson's talk. So basically, he talked about random number generators and how we on a global scale are sort of influencing them. So that's a psychokinesis experiment, very different from things I've been presenting here, but that's still psychokinesis, so we can sort of draw some connections here. So the atmosphere, I would argue, does act as a random system. Now, of course, there's some physical question of, okay, well, on what scale? Are quantum effects really important for things like cloud physics and turbulence and, all that good stuff? But it's still, it's really impossible to describe mathematically, even though it might be more causal in a sense than the way the random number generators work. It's still basically, at its fine structure at least, it's at least a very chaotic system, if not truly random. I would argue anyway. Um, you could do this experiment on a global scale. You could, instead of random number generators, set up things like, wind meters at random locations and designate these as like observing data and see if you get the same correlations. I mean, who knows? It's a far out idea, but could be true. Okay, so multiphasic model of precognition. So this talk focused on information gain forms of psi, specifically like the remote viewing. But I argue you can extrapolate this idea to psychokinesis. So he talked about a neuroscience and physics domain. So like the neuroscience domain, does the brain function in the same way as it would for precognition? And for the physics domain, does it basically work the same physically? And relating specifically to entropy, which he talked about, um, there is a whole thing called atmospheric thermodynamics, which we as undergraduates had, like I had to take a whole course on that. So there are specific things you can look for in the atmosphere and say the atmosphere has a higher or lower entropy. So maybe you can see if it's easier to influence weather in different levels of entropy, things like that. So I found this very, very interesting. By the way, this was this idea that you can just detonate like a nitrogen bomb, like an entropy bomb, and get better results. That kind of blew my mind. Okay, so paranormal healing studies. So this talked about basically bio-PK healing, right? And previously I mentioned, well, this is a new term I kind of want to coin, Gaia PK. And Gaia, you can think of that as like the Earth as like a living and breathing system, and it certainly needs healing with um, all of the stuff going on, climate change related. And in turn, you can maybe somehow relate Gaia PK to Bio PK, and more particularly, the effects of water. We have water in the atmosphere, we have water in our bodies. Maybe we can sort of see how it works in both cases and get a more general theory of how we interact with water in like a spiritual sort of way. And in their words, this would help us learn more of the how, when, and why of psi. That was specifically quoting from this presentation. Um, okay. So, creativity and psi. So, first of all, we need, as I mentioned in this talk, so we want to collect information about participants. Maybe that would be hard to do for population experiments, but for the more individualized experiments, we want to, collect information about them. Um, and maybe then the other thing we can do is compare and contrast the role of creativity in psychokinesis with the role of creativity in the more information gain type forms of psi. Yeah, which is what that talk mostly focused on. So the We're All Psychic talk, what I take from that, it's important to trust our relationship with the atmosphere and with nature, because that's when we get better results, is when we trust our ability with this. And I don't want to use that same wording like our ability to generate effects, because it's more of a relationship with nature than ability to like influence to cause it to do something. But still, that general idea is important to have trust in that relationship. We can think of becoming one with the atmosphere as sort of a philosophical tool maybe for like the population based experiments. And we want to think of the atmosphere as a conscious system, as I've been mentioning. Okay, and just some of this is not a particular talk, but just sort of relates to some of the ideas in the mediumship talks and presentations in general. Um, the consciousness after death hypothesis, which is separate from the psychokinesis hypothesis, which is separate from information gain forms of psi. But anyway, can we test that using mental weather influence? Right? Well, maybe it can. So, um, one of the talks talked about, how some mediums seem to be able to directly influence matter, and others like sort of gain information. So, we'd want probably maybe a medium with no direct history of mental weather influence to maybe contact a previous weather worker, such as Ted Owens, who I've talked about before, and maybe try to get some kind of effects similar to like what he would do when he was alive. Um, and alternatively, this is sort of a medium-less approach, but it may more directly get at the consciousness after death hypothesis. If like a computer system could be built to attempt to, at random intervals, at pre-specified or computer-generated specified locations and times, try to get effects. Um, that would sort of just maybe reduce the credits one would give to the idea that it's the medium just causing objects to behave in a certain way. This is not to discredit mediums at all, but this is just sort of an extra idea I thought of to try to get around this. Of course, if that works, then that would actually, give more credit to what mediums do in the first place. So I don't think it's bad at all. Okay, the applied precognition talk. So this is this talk talked about moving psi research more into practicality, taking it into real life. So on this thought, one idea I thought of is, okay, maybe try some kind of actual weather prediction. Have a population, maybe of hundreds of people, try to predict weather months to years in advance at very specific locations and times. For example, St. Louis, Missouri at 3 p.m. On this day 3 months from now. And also, while they do that, do 6 months from now at 3 p.m. in St. Louis, and 9 months, and just keep going out in time. And, plot the distribution of the predictions and compare it with that day to the days immediately ahead and before it. And because, you can get a sense of what the climate's going to be 3 months from now, but comparing like day-to-day weather, there's no way. Not with our current weather models. So just another sort of random idea, but connected to a main point in one of these presentations. Okay. This talk, we are all experiencers, so she talked a lot about experimenter effect really, really well. And I mean, basically, I'm saying I agree with that. So it shouldn't be just me doing experiments. I have my own kind of biases that may lead to positive or negative results. Okay, so for example, am I afraid of null results? Absolutely. I will admit that. I mean, maybe I shouldn't be, but I know that bias exists in me, and and I know I have to recognize it, in order to get good data. This next one is to sort of help me. So, the feedback for experimenters, like such as me, for example, if I'm the experimenter, It shouldn't occur until some number of trials have already been completed. I wouldn't want to look at data and then go, oh no, it's not working, and then get discouraged or something like that. Um, and yeah, and like no, situational awareness. Maybe sometimes the experimenter should actively participate, and maybe sometimes they should just observe or not observe. It's gonna depending on the situation and things like that. Okay, so that's pretty much my mental weather influence research proposal. So um, if you can, I'd like you to help. So please email me, and this is my email address, dannycaputi@optonline.net. Um, if you have any interest whatsoever in participating in any of these kind of mental weather influence experiments, and by emailing me or just you can also, if you're watching this on YouTube, just type your email in the comments or message me your email or anything, as long as I can get you on a list somehow. 100% non-binding. You will just be added to a mailing list where you'll be notified of developments as they unfold, and basically, yeah, that's all there is to it. Um, Please also contact me, like if you have any stories of possible mental weather influence that's happened in your life, or if you know of any um, of other people that you'd be willing to share, or that they would be willing to share rather, um, or they'd be okay with you sharing. Um, the catch, though, is that they really need to have traceable dates and locations. By traceable, I don't mean like you have to know exactly when, like, July 2nd, 1998, because, if you just say, like, oh, it was a storm in early summer of 2004, that's probably fine. I can probably go back and find a date. Um, but I need to have some kind of traceability to the date. Otherwise, it's not really something I can look into and see what happened in the atmosphere. Um, or if you know of any particularly gifted individuals who may be willing to participate in these more individualized experiments I was talking about, then yeah, please contact me, and of course reassure them they are not committed to anything. Hopefully, I articulated my ethics philosophy fairly well. Okay, and that's it. That is my presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for your attention.